Welcome to Debt Free in 30, where every week we talk about debt, money, and personal finance. I'm Doug Hoyes. So here's a question for you. Is there such a thing as good debt? If you ask financial advisors that question, they'll give you a variety of answers. One school of thought is that all debt is bad. With debt, you pay interest, which increases the cost of whatever it is that you financed. So the best strategy, they say, is to save money first, then buy what you want with cash so that you get the best deal and don't pay any interest. Makes sense. As a side benefit, because you have no debt, you'll never go bankrupt because bankruptcy only happens to people who have debt. I'm a bankruptcy trustee, so if everyone stopped borrowing, I'd be out of business because there'd be no more bankruptcies. I'm not sure if I like that concept or not. The other school of thought is that there is good debt and bad debt. Good debt is any debt that can be used to increase your wealth. The best example would be a mortgage, which is debt you incur to buy a house. You borrow money to buy the house, and you pay interest, so you end up paying more for the house than if you bought the house for cash, but over time, the house increases in value, and so in the long run, you're better off financially because you financed a house. In fact, without a mortgage, could any of us afford to buy a house? My wife and I have owned a few houses, and I know we didn't pay cash for any of them. We always had a mortgage because that was the only way we could afford to buy a house. That's the opinion of Pat Foran, the CTV television's consumer reporter and author of many books, including his latest, The Smart, Savvy Young Consumer. In chapter 15 of that book, he talks about good debt versus bad debt. I wanted to hear his thoughts, so I called him up and asked him if there really is such a thing as good debt, or would it be better for some people, and in particular young people, to avoid debt altogether? Here's what he told me.
Yeah, well, I think these days it's pretty much impossible to live without having some debt, especially a mortgage. I think what I was trying to say in the book to young people is that they should know that there is a difference between good debts and bad debts. And whenever I go out to schools, I talk to them about, is borrowing money to buy a house good debt or bad debt? Well, I think that's good debt. You're going to live somewhere anyway. Is borrowing money to go to Cancun for 2 weeks good debt or bad debt? And they're pretty quick to figure out that that's bad debt because you just come home and you just have a bunch of pictures from a trip. And then there are areas that might be a little more gray, making a stock investment. Well, it can be good debt, or it can be bad if it goes south. So I think there are different examples of good debt and bad debt that young people should think about early. And so I think, that there are cases of good debt and bad debt, and young people can, learn about them and think about them and just be cognizant of it. It's good for them.
Do you worry about what the real estate market is doing these days, particularly in Toronto, with it being, potentially overinflated? Do you worry that even though mortgage is good debt, buying a house today, could end up being a bad investment, or do you think that's probably not a big worry?
Oh no, I think it's a very legitimate worry, and I'm worried for young people today. Things are tough for young people today, finishing school, having school debt, maybe not making as much money as people may have years ago, and then having to look to buy a house, which is going to cost them, in Toronto, they're saying the average house is almost $1 million.
Yeah.
So yes, I've already interviewed someone who's concerned about the condo market in Toronto and believes that there's correction that's going to be underway in the condo market. I would be very concerned for anyone, leveraging themselves too much and buying a condo that, they might be on the edge of their expenses. And the other thing, too, is that some condo companies are now throwing in all kinds of things to try to get people to buy, but maintenance fees are also going through the roof. And actually, I just had an email from an older person today that they were just slapped with a $12,000 fee on their condo because they have to get the balcony repaired. I mean, what can a young person do? Certainly, I live in 905. I live in the outside, area of Toronto. Maybe you have to start with a townhouse or something like that. But certainly, I think many people are concerned that the housing market is overvalued because homes are going for over asking now, and I just don't know how long that can continue.
That was Pat Foran, CTV Television's consumer reporter and author of many books. Pat knows a lot about personal finance, and I think he has a very balanced view of the issue that we're talking about today: good debt versus bad debt. He believes that, as he said, it's pretty much impossible to live without having some debt. How can someone just starting out possibly buy a house? Even if it's a small condo in a small town, who can save $150,000? And if you want to buy a small condo in a big city like Toronto, forget it. It may take you decades to save a few $100,000 to buy that house. That's why people tell you it's better to get a mortgage, because then instead of paying rent, the money you would have paid in rent goes towards the mortgage. If you own, you don't pay rent, so all of your housing dollars go towards your mortgage. That also makes sense, but as they say, the devil is in the details. If you make $3,000 a month and rent costs $1,000 a month, you've got $2,000 a month for other living expenses and savings. That sounds like a comfortable life to me. If you make $3,000 a month and you're paying $2,000 a month on your mortgage and property taxes and condo fees and house insurance, you now only have $1,000 a month to live on. That sounds very stressful to me. That's what they mean when they say you are house rich but cash poor. It's great to own a house, but if you have nothing to live on, is that a good plan? So, is a mortgage good debt or bad debt? It depends on your cash flow and your unique circumstances. It's not a simple question. I've got other experts who have some thoughts on this topic, so let's take a quick break and return and continue to answer the question: is there good debt or is all debt bad? We'll be back after the break. You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Welcome back to this special edition of Debt Free in 30, where we're discussing good debt versus bad debt. Is there really such a thing as good debt? Or is all debt bad? For another viewpoint, I've invited back to the show Robert Brown, the author of Wealthing Like Rabbits, a great personal finance book. If you didn't hear my original interview with Robert, you can find it on iTunes or go to hoys.com and search for Robert Brown or Wealthing Like Rabbits, which is the name of his book. It was show number 14 where we covered a lot of topics, so it's worth the listen. Robert, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
So in your book, you discussed good debt versus bad debt. So tell me your thoughts. Is there such a thing as good debt or is all debt bad? I mean, as a bankruptcy trustee, I'm sitting here thinking, well, you know what? If you never had debt, you'd never get into trouble. You'd never have to go bankrupt. So I can certainly make the argument that all debt is bad. It's cut and dry, really simple. What do you think?
Well, traditionally, good debt is described as some money that's borrowed to buy something that's going to appreciate in value, like a mortgage on a house or something that's going to grow in its value, so you've taken on the debt for good reason. Bad debt is money borrowed to buy something that's going to depreciate in value, consumer goods or going to a restaurant. That's bad debt. But it's important to understand that not all good debt is good and not all bad debt is bad. Now, this is going to get a little wordy. You can have bad good debt if you go out and buy a great big house that has a great big mortgage. That house will likely appreciate in value over time, and technically that makes the big mortgage good debt. But it's unlikely that it's going to appreciate enough to cover the cost of the interest you will pay on the mortgage, let alone the larger expenses that great big house is going to generate. Therefore, the good debt is bad debt. It becomes bad good debt. On the other side of that coin, Doug, if your car unfortunately breaks down and you have to go out and get a 2-year loan to go out and buy a 2-year-old Honda Civic to get your kids to school and back, that is technically bad debt because that car is going to depreciate in value. However, that's still money that was probably better spent than going out and buying an expensive new car or by leasing a car. You should pay the loan off as quickly as you can and get that behind you, but the Civic's still going to have value well after the loan's paid off. So that loan becomes good bad debt.
So you're taking two different concepts here, good debt and bad debt, and kind of marrying them. So you're taking the traditional definition. Good debt is debt you incur that's going to help you increase your wealth in the future. Buying a house being an obvious one. A mortgage is traditionally thought of as good debt because it allows me to buy a house that's going to increase in value. What you're saying is, yeah, okay, but there are bad mortgages. There are bad good debt.
And on a larger scale, what I'm asking the reader to do is think about their debt and whether or not it makes sense in a larger context. A big mortgage on a big house has put a lot of people into bankruptcy, as you know, Doug. And traditionally, that would be described as good debt because chances are that house is going to appreciate in value. Bad debt, money that's going to depreciate in value, if it's well thought out, if it's well considered and is paid off quickly and is something that you can afford in the larger context of your finances, might be the right decision at the time. I think the traditional definitions of good debt and bad debt don't take it far enough. There's a lot of people out there with good, and I'm using the exclamation marks as I say good housing debt that can't afford to put money away for their kids, that can't afford to put money away for their future, that can't afford any luxuries in life or go on vacation because they've got this good debt.
And so it's a question of size then, of amount. So getting a mortgage of $50,000 so I can buy a $200,000 house, which is easily affordable for me, obviously that would be good debt.
Good debt.
But buying a $1 million house with a $950,000 mortgage, which I can't afford because I only make $50,000 a year, that's traditionally thought of as good debt. It's a mortgage, but that would be a bad example of it. And the difference being size then, is that really what it comes down to?
Difference being size, and you mentioned income as well. Difference being capacity. What kind of capacity does your income have to support that level of debt as well?
So you have to look at all debt in terms of your capacity to service it. Is that ultimately what determines good debt versus bad debt? Or is it the use that you're putting it to that is also got to be factored into it?
I think another factor is whether or not that debt, good or bad, could have been avoided or spent better otherwise in the first place. If just because you might be financially able to go out and buy a new car and take on some debt, that doesn't necessarily make it good or bad. You have to ask yourself, what could have I done with that money instead? Would have that money been better off paying down some of my mortgage? Would have that money been better off investing into my RSP or my tax-free savings account for my long-term future? Just because you may have the income to support a certain level of debt, that alone doesn't make it good or bad. It's what we do with our money.
So you're talking about opportunity cost there.
I am.
Which I have a degree in economics, so I remember that concept from many, many years ago. But that's something you talk about in the book as well. And stated very simply, you can only spend a loonie once. That's really the concept.
Yes.
I've got a loonie, I can spend it once, and do I want to spend it on payments on the house or the car? Do I want to put it in my RSP? So I've got to ask myself a couple of different questions then when I'm trying to decide is something good debt or bad debt. Number one, what's it being used for? Number two, do I have the capacity to pay it back?
And number three, would have your money been spent better elsewhere?
And so if instead of buying that bigger house, I had invested the money in my RSP, in a TFSA, in my children's education, in something else, maybe over the long term, I would have been better off.
Exactly.
So you're a big advocate then for thinking.
Yeah. You know, when we talk about good debt versus bad debt, I don't think it's right to say one is, I don't think it's a black and white situation, but you're right. In that book, I presented it in that way just to get the reader to think about their debt and whether or not it makes sense for their long-term finances.
Well, and that's really the whole point of me doing this show is to get people to think. And because if you sit there and say, oh, a mortgage is always good, borrowing for a car is always bad, or whatever you want to do, we can always present a case that disagrees with that opinion. So
it's interesting. I get asked a lot of personal finance questions, and almost always my answer will start with, it depends. Every situation is different. So it's hard to put black and white rules on everybody's personal finances. You know, is debt bad? Is debt good? I lean toward the bad, but I also recognize there are times when debt makes sense. But as long as you're sticking to the fundamentals of personal finance, spending less than you earn, living within your means, always saving some money for your long-term future, being comfortable with what you have rather than being possessed by what you don't yet have, you're going to be fine in the long term.
And that's a great way to end it. Thank you very much. We're talking about good debt versus bad debt. My guest for this segment was Robert Brown, author of Wealthing Like Rabbits. And you can go to the show notes at hoys.com to find out how to order the book, or you can go to wealthinglikeраbbits.com and all the information is there.
Thanks, Doug. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Robert. We'll be right back. You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Welcome back to our special Good Debt versus Bad Debt show here on Debt Free in 30. Before I give you my thoughts, let's hear from one more expert, and that's my guest from last week's show, Robin Taub, who made exactly the same point that Pat Foran made in the first segment, and that's that you can't really avoid debt. Here's what she told me.
So I think in life, you can't really avoid debt because for the big purchases in your life, you're going to need to borrow money. So I talked about earlier getting a mortgage on a house or buying your first car. But there's a difference between debt that you take on to purchase an asset that has the potential to go up in value if you have to borrow money to go to university. You're investing in your future earning power. So those are examples of good debt because the debt is associated with that as an asset. Bad debt, on the other hand, is debt that you incur to purchase consumption items, so clothes, restaurant meals, entertainment, things that don't appreciate, that don't go up over time, where sometimes they actually go down the minute you walk out of the store with them. So these are just consumption items that you really should have the money already saved before you buy them. This isn't the kind of thing that you want to put on your credit card because, as I said earlier, if you can't pay it off, you're going to be paying compound interest monthly at very high interest rates. And before you know it, that consumption item has cost you so much more than the original sticker price.
That was Robin Taub, author of A Parent's Guide to Raising Money Smart Kids, giving her thoughts on good debt versus bad debt. She agrees with what our other experts have said. Good debt is debt that's associated with an asset, like a house. Bad debt is money you borrow for consumption, like clothes, meals, or entertainment. So, what have our experts told us? Let's review. It's time for the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. In our first segment, Pat Foran from CTV Television says that there is good debt. He told us that a mortgage can be good debt, but borrowing to go to Cancun for a 2-week vacation is obviously bad debt. In our second segment, Robert Brown, author of Wealthing Like Rabbits, gave us the conventional definition of good debt, which is debt used to buy something that will appreciate in value, like a house, and bad debt is used to finance something that has no lasting value or will depreciate in value, like a vacation. As we just heard from Robin Taub, she agrees with those definitions. That's the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. Before we get to my thoughts on this, I'd like to go back to a point made by Robert Brown. He made an interesting point. He said, all good debt is not good, and all bad debt is not bad. He said that you can have bad good debt, like if you buy a big house with a mortgage larger than you can afford. The mortgage may be an example of a good type of debt, but for you, it's bad debt because you can't afford it. If your car breaks down and you have to buy a used car, that may appear to be bad debt because you just bought a car that will depreciate in value. However, even though it may appear to be a bad type of debt, financing an inexpensive car may be, for you, good debt because it's more affordable than financing a much more expensive car. Robert made the point that it's not just the debt you have to consider, but also your capacity to service that debt. Your income and cash flow is more important than the amount of the debt when you're crunching the numbers and deciding whether or not it's good debt or bad debt for you. So what do I think? Is there good debt and bad debt? There's no doubt that there is bad debt. I think we can all agree on that point. If you end up with so much debt that you have to go bankrupt, that was bad debt. That's easy. But is there good debt? I can easily make the case that no, there is no such thing as good debt. 100 years ago, when my grandfather was 16 years old and just starting out in the world, he didn't have debt. I'm sure he never had a credit card or a line of credit, and I suspect that when he bought his first house, many decades ago, he paid cash because that's just the way it was. It is possible to survive and thrive without debt. You don't have to have a credit card or bank loan or car loan or mortgage. You don't have to pay interest, and you can pay cash. But if you make the decision to avoid debt, that also means that you probably won't be able to buy the stuff that your friends are buying, at least not right away. I agree that it's very difficult when you're just starting out to pay cash for a new car. If you want to avoid car debt, you have to make the decision to buy an old clunker. That's what I did. My first car when I was 18 years old cost me $500 and I drove it for 4 years until it finally died. It broke down a lot, but at the time, more than 30 years ago. I had no choice. The point is, debt, when it comes to buying a car, is a choice. You can take the bus, or you can pay cash for an old junker, or you can save for a long time to buy a new car for cash, or you can finance a new car. What's the right choice? That's not for me to say. If you work the night shift and there's no bus service and you live 30 kilometers from work, you probably need a car. If borrowing is the only way to get it, and the numbers make sense, then you borrow to buy a car. For you, that car loan may be good debt. If you're a 20-year-old male going to college and you want to borrow to buy a fancy car so you look cool, I get it, you're a guy, but that sure sounds to me like bad debt. So my answer to the good debt versus bad debt question is this. If you can avoid debt, avoid it. You pay no interest, and you can never get behind on your payments. Your life may not be fancy, but it will be stress-free. If you must borrow for a big purchase like a car or a house, fine. I've done both myself. The key is to crunch the numbers first and be absolutely sure that you can make all of the payments even if your income drops or you have some other unexpected glitch in your life. I think the reason we get into debt trouble is because we don't think. We don't make a plan. We don't consider the downside to borrowing. If we did, we would avoid bad debt and perhaps even avoid a lot of the debt that we think is good debt. That's our show for today. Full show notes are available on our website, and I'd love to hear your comments, which you can leave right on our website at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.